It started with words that cut across continents, like sharpened blades, words spoken by a man who thrives on controversy and power, words that carried the weight of a legacy built on defiance and dominance. Donald Trump, in one of his now infamous public addresses, made it clear that BRICS, that coalition of emerging economies once dismissed as little more than a political talking point, had become a direct threat to Washington's global order, and his solution, as always, was aggression, masked as strategy, a series of verbal assaults and policy hints aimed squarely at undermining the coalition and, more specifically, Brazil, the land of carnival and commodities, that had now become a chessboard square in a game larger than itself, because Trump understood, in the same way Washington's foreign policy architects have understood for decades, that BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa was no longer just a club of nations discussing economic cooperation. It was an idea, a movement, a threat to the unipolar world the United States had long enjoyed as its playground. And in Trump's mind, any challenge to American supremacy had to be crushed before it could mature into something unmanageable. So he came out swinging, labeling BRICS an anti-American alliance, accusing Lula da Silva of pandering to enemies of freedom, and framing the entire bloc as a puppet show orchestrated by China and Russia. But while Trump's rhetoric appealed to his base and satisfied those who still viewed the world through the Cold War's black and white lens, on the other side of this geopolitical battlefield stood Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, a man who, despite his flaws and controversies, had become the voice of Brazil's fight for sovereignty in an age where economic colonization often wears the disguise of partnership. And Lula, unafraid of the American microphone, responded with words that echoed through conference halls and newsrooms alike. "We do not want an emperor, and we do not want a world police," a statement so direct, so unambiguous, that it electrified BRICS supporters, while drawing the predictable ire of Washington hawks. But behind these headlines, behind the Twitter clips and sensational soundbites, lies a deeper, far more dangerous story, a story about why Trump is obsessed with BRICS, why Brazil matters more than casual observers realize, and why this confrontation, though cloaked in words, could redefine the global order in ways the average citizen, scrolling through social media, cannot begin to comprehend. Because when Trump attacks Brazil, he is not merely targeting Lula's government or criticizing an economic policy. He is signaling to the world that the United States, under his vision, will not sit idly by as alternative power centers rise, and that any nation daring to challenge American dominance, whether through trade agreements, currency deals, or rhetoric, will be met with economic, political, and perhaps even covert force. And to understand this fully, one must peel back the layers of history and strategy that brought us here, beginning with the evolution of BRICS itself. Once dismissed in Washington as little more than an acronym invented by investment bankers, but now transformed into a geopolitical force capable of rattling the very foundations of the US-led financial order, because it is not merely about Brazil selling soybeans to China or Russia, swapping oil for Indian pharmaceuticals. It is about a growing network of nations who are tired of being dictated to by Washington, tired of IMF loan strings that strangle rather than support, tired of a dollar-dominated system that can turn entire economies into pawns overnight. And for Trump, who built his political persona on restoring American greatness, the rise of BRICS is an insult, a challenge to his narrative that America is and must remain the uncontested leader of the world. But Brazil's role in this drama is unique, because unlike Russia and China, whose adversarial relationships with the United States are well established, Brazil was once seen as a potential ally, a bridge between North and South, a country too consumed by domestic chaos to assert itself on the global stage. Yet Lula's return to power changed that calculus entirely. For under his leadership, Brazil has not only revitalized its role in BRICS, but has become a vocal advocate for de-dollarization, for alternative development banks, for a world where Washington is one voice among many, rather than the sole conductor of the global orchestra. And this terrifies Trump and his allies, because they know that if Brazil, the largest economy in Latin America, aligns itself more deeply with China, with Russia, with this coalition of the global South, then the United States loses its grip on a region it has historically viewed as its backyard, and that loss of influence cannot be allowed, not under Trump's watch. So he has chosen the path he knows best: attack, ridicule, destabilize, threaten, hoping that by undermining Lula personally and casting BRICS as an anti-American conspiracy, he can fracture the bloc and remind Brazil of the costs of straying too far from Washington's shadow. But Lula, a man forged in the fires of labor activism and political persecution, is not so easily intimidated. And his defiance is rooted not just in ideology but in a calculated understanding of the moment, that the world is shifting, that the unipolar era is fading, that nations like Brazil finally have the leverage to negotiate on their own terms, rather than accept whatever scraps fall from Washington's table. And so when he rejects the idea of the United States as emperor or world police, he is not simply engaging in political theater, he is articulating the aspirations of dozens of nations who see in BRICS a chance to break free from the cycle of dependency. And this is why the confrontation between Trump and Lula matters, why it is more than just a war of words. Because what we are witnessing is the opening act of a new Cold War. One fought not with tanks or nuclear warheads, at least not yet, but with currency swaps, trade alliances, media campaigns, and political posturing. And while Trump's critics dismiss his comments as bluster, they fail to recognize the method in his madness, for Trump has always understood the power of narrative, the power of framing conflicts in ways that rally his supporters and intimidate his opponents, and by portraying BRICS as an existential threat to American freedom, he is laying the groundwork for policies, tariffs, sanctions, perhaps even covert operations that could reshape the economic landscape of entire continents. But even as he does this, the question remains: can the United States, even under Trump, truly stop the momentum of BRICS? Can Washington isolate Brazil without driving it further into the arms of Beijing and Moscow? And perhaps most importantly, does Trump's America even have the global credibility to play world police in an era when so many nations are openly rejecting that very role? These are the questions that hang in the air, like the thick smoke of a battlefield after the first shots are fired. And as the cameras focus on Trump's fiery speeches and Lula's sharp retorts, the real battle is being waged behind closed doors, in boardrooms, in trade negotiations, in the quiet but relentless maneuvering of diplomats and financiers who understand that this is not just about Brazil, not just about BRICS, not even just about Trump. This is about the future of global power itself, about whether the 21st century will belong to a single empire or to a chorus of nations demanding their place in the sun. And as this new Cold War begins, one thing is certain: the days of American unquestioned dominance are numbered. But whether Trump's firebrand approach will slow that decline or accelerate, it remains to be seen, and that is the cliff on which we now stand, staring down a future that promises more turbulence, more conflict, and perhaps, just perhaps, the birth of a world order unlike anything we have ever known. The clash between BRICS and Washington is no longer a subtle diplomatic tug of war fought in the quiet corridors of international summits. It has become a visible, visceral confrontation between two competing visions of the world, one anchored in the American legacy of unipolar dominance, where the dollar is king, Western institutions define economic stability, and the United States reserves the right to intervene wherever and whenever it sees fit, and the other embodied by BRICS, an increasingly assertive coalition of nations who have collectively declared that they will no longer accept being perpetual spectators in a game rigged in favor of the West. And while Donald Trump may have amplified the volume of this confrontation with his uniquely combative rhetoric, the tension between Washington and BRICS is deeper than any one presidency, rooted in decades of resentment, structural inequality, and an imbalance of power that has left entire regions of the world feeling economically strangled, politically undermined, and socially humiliated. Because for years BRICS was treated by Washington think tanks as a novelty, a symbolic grouping of diverse economies with no real teeth, but as China's Belt and Road Initiative rewired trade routes, as Russia leveraged its energy exports to bypass Western sanctions, as India emerged as a digital superpower, as South Africa solidified its role as the gateway to Africa, and as Brazil reclaimed its voice under Lula da Silva, BRICS evolved from a conversation into an institution, from an acronym into an axis of influence. And that evolution has been a nightmare for Washington's foreign policy establishment, which now finds itself scrambling to contain a bloc that not only challenges U.S. trade hegemony, but also dares to imagine a world where the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are no longer the sole arbiters of economic salvation, where countries can transact in their own currencies rather than the dollar, where development loans come without the neo-colonial strings attached. And this is why Trump, for all his unfiltered bombast, is in some ways a blunt instrument of a deeper strategy, one that transcends party lines, because the United States, whether under Trump, Biden, or any future president, cannot afford to let BRICS reshape the global order uncontested. And yet the tools at Washington's disposal are not what they once were, because the same economic sanctions that crippled smaller states now push BRICS members closer together. The same political pressure that once bent governments to American will now fuels nationalist defiance. And the same media narratives that once demonized dissent now seem hollow to populations that have lived through the consequences of American intervention. And at the center of this storm stands Brazil, geographically distant from the Eurasian core of BRICS, but strategically positioned as its Latin American linchpin, a country that Washington has long considered part of its hemispheric sphere of influence, yet whose leadership under Lula is now making bold moves to redefine its role, from advocating for BRICS' own payment systems to hosting dialogues about creating an alternative to the SWIFT banking network. And these aren't just symbolic gestures, they are acts of economic rebellion, declarations that Brazil and its BRICS partners will not forever be tethered to an order built on the ruins of colonialism and maintained through the coercive power of Western finance. But the question that looms like a storm cloud over every one of these developments is whether Washington will allow it, because history tells us that when American dominance is challenged, the response is rarely passive, and Trump's escalatory rhetoric toward Brazil is a harbinger of what could come, a signal that tariffs, covert operations, political destabilization, and other levers of influence are all on the table. Yet the United States faces a paradox, because the more aggressively it pushes back, the more it risks validating BRICS' narrative of American imperialism. The more it risks driving Brazil deeper into China's orbit, the more it risks turning an economic rivalry into a full-blown geopolitical fracture that reshapes alliances for generations. And this is why Trump's words, as provocative as they are, should not be dismissed as mere political theater, because behind them lies a bipartisan consensus in Washington that BRICS must be contained, that a multipolar world must be managed before it becomes uncontrollable. But containing BRICS is not like containing the Soviet Union, because BRICS is not a monolithic enemy with a single ideology or military bloc. It is a fluid, flexible coalition of states with different priorities, bound not by shared political systems, but by shared grievances and shared opportunities. And this makes it more dangerous in some ways, because it cannot be easily isolated or demonized. And if the United States underestimates this reality, it may find itself fighting not just to maintain its global dominance, but to maintain its very relevance in a century where power is shifting eastward, southward, and beyond the traditional corridors of Washington, London, and Brussels. And as this grand tug-of-war intensifies, the stakes could not be higher. Because this is not just a conflict about tariffs or currency swaps, it is about the soul of the 21st century. About whether the next 100 years will be defined by a single hegemon, or by a messy, unpredictable, yet perhaps more equitable multipolar order. And in this struggle, Brazil is no longer just a pawn to be manipulated, but a player whose moves could tip the balance of the entire game. And if Trump believes that attacking Lula with words and threats will break Brazil's resolve, he may soon learn that the days when Washington could dictate terms to the global South are over. And that the only thing more dangerous than a coalition of nations seeking to challenge American power is a coalition that has nothing left to lose. Which is precisely what BRICS is becoming as its members dig in their heels, fortify their economic partnerships, and prepare for a confrontation that could reshape the world far more profoundly than the old Cold War ever did. Because this time, the battlefield is everywhere on trade routes, in cyberspace, in resource markets, in financial systems, and the weapons are not tanks and missiles, but currencies, infrastructure projects, media narratives, and diplomatic realignments. And as Washington tightens its grip, BRICS is slipping through its fingers, rewriting the rules of global engagement. One quiet deal, one audacious statement, one act of defiance at a time, leaving us to wonder not whether the United States can stop BRICS, but whether it can even understand what it is truly up against before it is too late. There is a moment in every nation's history when its leader steps into the global arena, not just as a representative of their people, but as a symbol of defiance against centuries of imbalance. And for Brazil, that moment came when Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, a man who once walked the factory floors as a laborer and rose through the ranks of politics carrying the scars of both poverty and persecution, stood before the world and declared that Brazil would no longer bow to the self-appointed emperors of the international order. His words sharp, almost surgical in their intent. We do not want an emperor, and we do not want a world police. And while the phrase was celebrated across the global South as a rallying cry for sovereignty in Washington, it landed like a slap across the face of an establishment that had grown accustomed to Brazil playing the role of a compliant partner. But Lula's statement was more than political theater. It was an articulation of a philosophy that had been quietly taking shape across much of the developing world, one that rejects the idea that global leadership must mean global domination, one that challenges the very premise of a unipolar order sustained by military bases, economic coercion, and the soft power of cultural imperialism. And for Lula, this vision is deeply personal, forged in his understanding of what it means to be on the receiving end of global hierarchies, where decisions made in Washington and Brussels ripple outward to crush workers in São Paulo, farmers in Africa, and small entrepreneurs in South Asia. And his stand is also strategic, rooted in Brazil's unique position as a Latin American powerhouse that can no longer afford to be a silent bystander in the reconfiguration of world power. Because for decades Brazil has been viewed as an economic giant, trapped in the body of a political dwarf, unable or unwilling to leverage its resources, population, and geography into meaningful influence. But under Lula's leadership, the nation has started to shed that image, using BRICS as its platform to amplify its voice, to champion de-dollarization, to demand reforms in global financial institutions, and to advocate for a multipolar world where power is not monopolized by one nation but shared among many. And while critics in Washington have dismissed these ambitions as naive, there is nothing naive about Lula's strategy, which is as pragmatic as it is bold. Because he understands that Brazil cannot confront the United States militarily, cannot decouple from the Western economy overnight, but it can, alongside its BRICS partners, build alternative pathways, trade and local currencies, development banks free from Western conditionalities, and political alliances that create leverage where none existed before. And in doing so, it can slowly chip away at the architecture of American hegemony. And this is precisely why Lula has become a lightning rod for Trump's ire. Because his leadership represents not just Brazil's defiance, but the embodiment of a broader rebellion that Trump and his allies fear could spread like wildfire, destabilizing a global order that has long been tilted in Washington's favor. And yet, for all the strength of Lula's rhetoric, he walks a dangerous path. Because Brazil's economy is still deeply intertwined with that of the United States. Its industries reliant on Western markets and technologies. Its elites divided between allegiance to the old order and curiosity about the new. And navigating this tension requires a political dexterity that few leaders possess. But Lula, ever the negotiator, ever the survivor, has shown that he is willing to balance pragmatism with principle, to engage Washington where necessary, but never at the expense of Brazil's sovereignty, and his boldness is resonating beyond BRICS, inspiring other nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to reconsider their own positions in the global hierarchy, to ask themselves why they must always bend to the will of a nation that lectures them about democracy while undermining it whenever it suits its interests. And this is the great irony of the current moment, that Trump, in his attempt to weaken BRICS by attacking Lula, may have inadvertently strengthened its resolve, because his bluster has given Lula the perfect foil, the perfect example of why BRICS exists in the first place. And in the court of global public opinion, every insult Trump hurls only deepens. The narrative of Washington as a bully desperate to maintain its fading throne. But whether Lula's vision of a multipolar world can survive the inevitable backlash remains uncertain, because history teaches us that when empires are challenged, they do not go quietly, and as the pressure mounts, as the tools of economic warfare are sharpened and deployed, as Washington's allies in Brazil's political and corporate circles whisper their discontent, the question is not just whether Lula can withstand the storm, but whether Brazil can hold the line without fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions. Because leading a rebellion against an empire is one thing, but sustaining it in the face of relentless retaliation is something else entirely. And yet if anyone can do it, perhaps it is Lula, a man whose political career is a testament to resilience, who has been jailed, vilified, written off, and yet still returned to power, with the backing of millions who see in him not just a politician, but a fighter for their dignity, their sovereignty, their place in a world that has too often treated them as expendable. And as he leads Brazil through this turbulent chapter, his defiance is more than a national stance, it is a declaration that the age of unquestioned American supremacy is over, that the emperor has no clothes, and that the future, whatever shape it takes, will be written not by a single hand in Washington, but by many, across continents, across cultures, across a world that is finally waking up to its own power. The future of BRICS, and by extension, the future of US power, hangs in a balance more precarious than most analysts are willing to admit. Because while the rhetoric is easy to track Trump's threats, Lula's defiance, China's calculated diplomacy, Russia's defiance of Western sanctions, the deeper question is whether this coalition can survive the immense pressure Washington is certain to exert in the coming years. Because history is littered with alliances that began with bold promises of sovereignty and independence only to fracture under the weight of internal divisions and external sabotage. And make no mistake, the United States has no intention of watching BRICS grow unchecked. Not when it threatens the very foundations of the global financial system that underpins American power. Not when it opens doors for countries long marginalized by the West to find new paths of growth, trade, and political influence. And this is where Trump's strategy, for all its fire and fury, may actually mask the more insidious and enduring efforts of Washington's foreign policy establishment, which does not need to declare war to wage it, because the tools of modern empire are quieter, but no less effective targeted sanctions designed to isolate economies, covert funding of opposition movements to destabilize governments, the weaponization of media narratives to erode public trust in leaders like Lula, and the deployment of trade incentives to lure BRICS members back into the American fold. And the question is whether BRICS, a bloc of nations with differing political systems, economic priorities, and security concerns, can maintain its cohesion in the face of such relentless pressure, because while its members share a common grievance against Western hegemony, they do not share a common vision for what comes next, with China envisioning a world order centered around its Belt and Road Initiative, Russia using BRICS as a shield against its isolation, India balancing its participation with its ties to the West, and Brazil and South Africa seeking leverage for development rather than domination. And in this divergence lies both the strength and the weakness of BRICS, because its flexibility allows it to adapt, to bring new members into the fold, to present itself as a champion of the global South. But it also makes it vulnerable to fracture, to being played off against itself by a United States that has mastered the art of divide and rule. And yet, for all these vulnerabilities, there is an undeniable momentum behind BRICS that cannot be dismissed. A momentum fueled by decades of frustration with a system that promises partnership but delivers exploitation. A momentum amplified by the growing realization that the future will not be written solely in Washington or Brussels. And this is why Trump's attacks, however theatrical they may appear, are rooted in genuine fear. Because if BRICS succeeds in creating an alternative financial system, if it succeeds in bypassing the dollar, if it succeeds in uniting enough nations under the banner of multipolarity, then the United States will face something it has not faced in over a century. The prospect of no longer being the world's uncontested superpower. And that is why this struggle, though couched in economic terms, is existential. Because for Washington, losing its grip on the global order means losing far more than prestige. It means losing the ability to shape the world in its image, to enforce its values, to safeguard its economic dominance. And for BRICS, the stakes are equally high. Because failure would not just mean the continuation of the old order, it would mean a new wave of subjugation, a reassertion of Western dominance made even harsher by the audacity of their attempted rebellion. And so the world watches as these titans collide, knowing that the outcome of this confrontation will not simply determine the fate of Brazil or the legacy of Trump, but will shape the trajectory of the entire 21st century, and perhaps beyond. For we are standing at a crossroads between the fading light of a unipolar empire and the uncertain dawn of a multipolar world. And whichever path humanity takes, it will not come without turbulence, for the birth of any new order is a painful process, full of chaos, conflict, and unintended consequences. And as this drama unfolds, one truth becomes increasingly clear. BRICS may not destroy the American empire overnight, but it has already forced it to look in the mirror and see what it has become. An emperor clinging to a throne that no longer commands the unquestioned loyalty of its subjects. A world police whose badge carries little legitimacy in the eyes of those it claims to protect. And in this recognition lies the beginning of the end for the old order, and the beginning of something new, something not yet fully formed, but undeniably rising, carried on the backs of nations who have decided that they will no longer wait for permission to claim their place in history.